Hello, Vicky. It is so good to see you. I'm glad you could take some time to hang out with me and just have a conversation about your time with Minnesota Opera and Wuthering Heights, which is coming up as one of our broadcast options for our season, which is our new season in this crazy pandemic period that we are all experiencing in different and complex ways. So thank you. I'm so excited to see you. Where am I? Where are you joining us from today?
Yeah, I'm in the luxurious location of my home in my studio where I have been teaching both private lessons and college lessons for the past 2 months or so. Thank you for having me, by the way.
Yeah, no, of course. It's always nice to see you. I'm so admirative of my colleagues in the industry who have begun to really feel out what life is like in this period. And I know that I jump from Zoom to Zoom on a regular basis at the opera now because I'm at home and not at work. And are you doing the same thing, sort of similar jumping from one digital meeting to the next?
Yeah, I've actually, speaking of the setup, it's like an essential is having a ring light. And now I've got a microphone. I've made the whole thing very glamorous as it could be. But I actually have one Zoom link and I just, for lessons, and I have people come in as they would if they were in person. It gives me a sense of sanity to like end one lesson and see the new face coming in. It feels normal, quote unquote. So yeah, pretty much 6 hours a day, something like that of
Oh,
Zoom
wow.
meetings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I want to hit rewind for a minute and just talk about we met when you were a member of the resident artist program at Minnesota Opera. Um, I think may have been after Wuthering Heights. I think that I probably met you in your third season here as
I
a
think
resident artist. I was in Arizona at the time and had come up to hear auditions and to hear a production on stage. And I remember I'd been asked by Dale and Floyd if I'd come in and hear some folks in the resident program. And yes, I was very excited. I think Anna was here too as an artist manager, and we sat in together just to hear all of the participants that year. And I remember being gobsmacked when you opened your mouth that there was so much rich, beautiful, well-developed sound, and loving that, and really going back and thinking about, okay, how is this going to move forward? We don't in this country we don't have a history of acknowledging sort of fuller voiced, richer voiced singers in the way that we might have 20 or 30 years ago. And and so I'm curious about your time in the program and how your career has developed. You've been with us fairly consistently since your time in the program. And so I'm wondering what your memories are and what do you even remember that audition that day?
I do remember that audition because I remember we discussed me covering in Il Trovatore, which for some administrative reasons with the opera wasn't going to pan out scheduling wise. But I remember that was the first sort of like big kid offer I had had and thought, oh my goodness, is this going to ruin it all by not being available? And here we are. But
Yeah.
you know, it was an interesting time auditioning for the program because I had found out through Floyd Anderson that I was actually choice number two. And that choice number one was a very good friend of mine who is still singing in Europe quite a bit, Stephanie Lauricella. And they were doing Cenerentola that year. And so Stephanie was the first choice because she had performed it so many times.
Sure.
And I obviously had not. And I was 23 at the time and had this large sort of unwieldy thing and didn't know what to do with it. So it was an interesting phone call when I first got offered the job because Floyd said to me in that conversation, well, we'll see what happens here. We've never hired anybody like you before. I thought, okay, all right, I guess we will see. And my very first assignment was covering David Daniels in Orfeo. So I was just sort of starstruck the whole time about the
Yeah.
entire thing in the process. But the things that I remember about the program were I always felt that my best interest as a singer was always being thought of and cultivated.
Mm.
When it's particularly early on in the program, we had bi-daily, so every other day we had yoga class, We had French diction class, I remember quite extensively with Mary Dibburn, who was the musical director at the time there, coordinator of the Raps, I guess you could say. And then that position moved on to Rob Ainsley. We got a lot of one-on-one coaching time with him, which was really great. A lot of classes in preparation for auditions. And Rob started to introduce some recital, but sort of as a constant theme throughout the whole process, I always felt like Floyd and Dale, particularly who were running the company at the time, were really interested in my development and what I wanted to be working on. So even though you get this list of assignments for the year, we were always very cognizant of what I would actually be doing in auditions. So
Yeah.
thankfully, I felt like that was always being thought of. And I also really fondly remember my relationships to the other resident artists. I mean, we discussed a little bit prior to this interview, just being in that club together and having
Yeah.
some memories of that, which is really nice. And I remember making great relationships with patrons as well.
Yeah.
I really thought it was nice to feel like we had a real connection with the people who were supporting us, not only financially, but emotionally too, who really were rooting for us to have careers. I actually just sang outdoors, very spaced out. Everyone wore masks, but I sang a gig for Chip Emery, who has been a long patron of the opera. So it's been nice to feel like that has come full circle and has served me well. But I have a lot of very fond memories, and I'm really grateful to the program for helping me cultivate my artistic point of view.
Yeah, I appreciate that too. And, you know, you mentioned something that has occurred to me often, but I don't know that I've verbalized it necessarily. And that is the type of patron, sort of community member here in Minnesota, I always have felt is vastly different from anywhere else in the country that I sing or that I did sing when I was on stage. And it was part of what really drew me back to this company. And I'm curious if there are aspects or characteristics of that group of folks that you've met that you can pinpoint and say, this is what's different about the Twin Cities audience and community that helps support the opera.
You know, coming from the coasts and having that patron experience, I would say the thing that struck me as different about being at Minnesota is I just felt there was an immediate personal connection into who I was, not only as an artist on stage
Yeah.
and what I was doing for the company, but really who I was as a person.
Yeah.
And I think that was pretty immediate in that our first few weeks, several patrons had us over for dinners, not to perform, you know, which is, of course, necessary and common.
What we're here to do. Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. But I also felt like many of them had those types of events just to, I'd like to know more about you. You're from New York. Tell me more about that. I lived in such and such a place in New York. Like I just felt like we had so many other things in common. And I I can say I've sung a few places now, and what I've loved about Minnesota is every time I did a donor event or a patron event, I always looked forward to it. It never felt like, okay, and then I'm gonna, which I don't mean to say for anyone else, in terms of those events, but I just think there's something about the culture in Minnesota where the people who are supporting the people on stage really care about the people that they're supporting. And I noticed that even with the guest artists too, coming back now as, you know, a rap alumni, is I'm still getting that same sort of connectivity and interest in my own person in addition to what I do on stage.
Yeah. This was also one of the few places that I felt like um, I feel like the audience has an interest in knowing the performers who are part of that Minnesota opera family in a way. That's different in some markets. It sort of feels like you're better if you're from somewhere else, regardless of your credential or your resume or your experience or your actual vocal gifts, or dramatic proclivities. That you're automatically better if you're from a faraway place and not necessarily homegrown talent. And I certainly wasn't. I didn't grow up in Minnesota, but I loved my time in the program for that reason. It felt like people were curious in a way that was deeper and more interesting and meaningful to me as an artist than in other places I'd been. So I'm happy to hear that that was similar for you and that that continues to this moment.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think you said this at an event. I was sort of pitch hitting for one of the resident artists. Was it 2 years ago? Was it
Oh, yeah,
a
yeah,
jukebox
for the
event?
Aria Jukebox, yeah.
That's right. And I was sort of last minute was like, oh, this person can't do it. Can you fill in? And I remember you saying, there's a lucky penny, but the company felt that I was more of like a lucky quarter. And I remember thinking in that moment, I'm really, really fortunate that I have found a place that appreciates what I offer and isn't deterred or, yeah, thinks negatively about the fact that I just happen to live here now.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's a really very fortunate to be in that situation.
So we're recording this interview before the broadcast of Wuthering Heights begins. But of course, that's what led me to want to have this conversation with you. You were part of the program. This was either your first, second, or third performance ever with the company. So we're going to see a 23-year-old Vicky Vargas participating in Wuthering Heights when the broadcast starts, or for those people who maybe already watched it and are coming to this interview late, that's just to give us a sort of time stamp on your work with the company here. But what are your recollections? This was a piece that was put into the season that was replacing a new work that had been in development. So it was a kind of a last minute substitution in terms of repertoire. It was new to us as a company because it was a North American premiere, but it wasn't a piece we'd commissioned. So there weren't lots of workshops that went before it and helped craft exactly what we wanted to see on the stage the first time. So here you are, you're brand new in the program, and you're handed a piece of music that no one here in this country had really spent any time with before. What's that like? What do you remember from that period?
Yeah, there's a few things I think. One is I remember immediately upon the rehearsal process, I believe Kelly Caduce was pregnant at the time, and she was going to sing the role of Kathy. So one of the things I remember is, for some personal reasons, Kelly could not come. And so I think, I want to say 2 weeks before the production started, they had to hire Sarah Jakubiak.
Yeah,
So the first thing I remember is, wow, how does that happen so fast? That this, she ended up just being marvelous, and everyone will see it or has already seen it post this interview. But, that was the first thing that took me by surprise, was how quickly someone could put something like this together without 10 recordings and coaches who specialize in that particular style. So that was kind of a shocker as a first time in that type of experience. I think the other thing was like learning new music. It just comes with its own set of tools that you need. That was also very surprising, as I had not done anything like that before. And oh, right, you also have to like act and be involved dramatically while also coming in at the right time. So there's that element of it. But one of the greatest memories I'd say I had about the production was that the cast was fairly small. So
Mhm.
it was my first insight, I felt, into really seeing the intimate collaboration process that happens. I was in a Cenerentola in that season as well, but the production was just so much more bigger and
Yeah,
bombastic.
yeah, yeah.
And this really felt like we were honing in on these individual characters and the relationship to each other. It was the first time I met a colleague and friend of mine, Adriana Zabala, and we got very close through that production, lots of rehearsals. I remember spending a lot of time with Eric Maggiore. I mean, there was just so many close relationships. And Eric Simonson asked a lot of us in that process of just an authentic and genuine experience. And I feel like that translates really well on camera. I think a lot of us bring a lot of intimacy and vulnerability to the performances in that particular recording. And I also remember little things like the costume designer Jane, I believe. I was in a costume fitting. It's my first time doing a costume fitting where I was creating the character. So that was kind of an interesting conversation. It wasn't like, well, you're going to wear the same dress that we've done in 12 other productions of this. It's like, no, this is being crafted for you for this production. And I just remember this very like interesting conversation of, I was playing Nellie, so I'm, essentially a maidservant role. And the costume shop said, well, we'll just put the buttons on Vicky's dress in the back, and then the costumer will just Velcro it, we'll pull it apart. And Jane said, I don't like that idea, because if she's supposed to be a maidservant, wouldn't she be putting on and off her own clothes? So we have to have the buttons in the front, and they have to be real buttons so that she can actually do that. And I remember being like, what? Like the amount of detail that has to go into just making you a person,
Yeah.
aside from what you're doing, was really just mind-boggling to me, and the first time I had experienced it on that level. So it was my first time, I think, really seeing the nitty-gritty of the art making in a way that has stuck with me ever since.
Yeah. And this particular, as you're talking about that level of detail that the designers put out on this production, I remember the first time I started seeing clips of Wuthering Heights, and to me, it evokes all kinds of like early viewing that I had of Merchant Ivory films, that are so specific in time and place and so detailed. And certainly Jane and Neil Patel and some of the other design team have had just tremendous careers, at which, this was just a moment in time on their long career arc. But do you remember what that's like to hear about that process, and then you're out on the Ordway stage for your first or second time in this thing that's been created for you, that's beautifully sort of realized from people's imaginations? What do you have a sense of what that felt like in that moment?
Yeah, I mean, I think I feel this way about a lot of new productions that I've done through Minnesota Opera. I think you feel much more connected to the piece.
Mm-hmm.
Feels like it's your part of the birthing process. I think you feel just so connected that way. And I also think in that moment, I remember thinking, you realize how much bigger than you something is or can be, particularly when we were filming. I do a little ariette called Poor Bairn in, I think it's the second act. And I just remember it's like just me and Joshua, the young boy, and the lights. And I just remember feeling very overwhelmed, not the right word, but washed over by the breadth of everything that had come together in this production. So yeah, I don't know. It's a very surreal feeling to think like this is the first time people are experiencing this, and you're a puzzle piece in this master puzzle or something. Yeah, it's very cool.
This beautiful, it's a beautiful realization that what you're doing is integral and essential and also small.
Yeah.
And I mean, regardless of the size of your role, you are part of a larger piece, and the work is essential. We couldn't do it without you as a singer, and there's a gazillion more pieces of that puzzle that have to come together to put that on.
Yeah, and I remember the technical elements of that. Gosh, the lighting design and the projections, it's like that alone could be its own production. I mean, it's just yeah, you really realize in something like that how necessary that is as well, in addition to people just barking on stage.
Yeah, exactly. So if you had to, I know it's probably hard to I hate these kinds of questions when people ask me, but I feel obligated. Is there a moment of Wuthering Heights that you think, that's the bit for me? That's where this story turns. That's where the piece really hits me, and what sticks with me long after the fact.
Yeah, I was thinking that when I was watching some of it back. There's this beautiful scene where Kathy, she just kind of starts to unravel and tears her pillow apart and is looking at these individual feathers. And it was so interesting to watch now, almost a decade later, because I felt like I could immediately put myself in that moment. And I just remember that, I think for that character, for Nellie, that was sort of the moment. I think with a lot of these maid servant roles, if you will, oftentimes we're just an external reflection of what the audience is feeling.
Right.
In the first act, I'm singing happy Christmas songs, like, let's not be upset about this terrible time. And then Ben Wager's character in the second act putting a knife in my mouth, which was also a thrilling experience. I've never had to do that on stage since, but that took a lot of rehearsals with the fight choreographer. But I think it was this moment with Sarah that I felt like the character realized like this is just not, there's no salvaging this to
Yeah.
what the innocence that it used to be. And I remember just, and people will see this, it's like the way she touched each individual feather and just clung to that pillow, your heart really breaks for that character. And I'm kind of in the background lurking, as maidservants tend to do in those scenes. But I think that was sort of the moment where the character takes a shift into realizing this is never going to be as it was. And
Yeah.
Sarah did a lovely job of depicting that.
So that sounds, talking about things are never going to be as it was. you know, um, we think a lot about how life imitates art, how art imitates life. Um, and certainly the moment that we find ourselves in with sort of a very late to the party reckoning with race in our country and the pandemic and the reality of trying to find the right path forward so that we can stay afloat while strategizing how to combat this disease. I think most of us in the industry are thinking about how nothing will ever be quite like it was before. And are there lessons more specifically within Wuthering Heights more broadly that you think are applicable to where we are right now? Are there other pieces of repertoire that you think, oh, this is a really interesting connection to where we are now? Anything?
Yeah, that's a great question. One thing I thought about when I was watching Wuthering Heights back and recalling the process and the memories was this idea of choices and how our choices just have such huge implications
Yeah,
for our futures. And I think that is certainly true for Heathcliff and Kathy. They just always seem to miss each other in a way that sometimes felt unnecessarily so from my character's perspective. But I think that was really true for them. Is she married into the Lintons, and he married Isabel Linton, and I think that really changed the trajectory for them in a not so positive way. But I think to relate it to the current crisis, I'm finding this to be true with colleagues that I'm chatting with all the time, which is we still have choices moving forward. I think there's something about COVID that it could be so easy to say, well, art's just not going to happen until 2022. That's just how it is. There's a pandemic going on. But I just continuously am surprised by choices of companies like Minnesota Opera. I posted about this to Ana de Archuleta, things she's doing with her agency in the industry. I think there are a lot of choices we could be making that maybe aren't going to move the art form forward in the exact same way that it was going to before on that trajectory. And I would argue maybe shouldn't be the case now anyway. But because we're still pursuing other options, I think we're going to find something really beautiful
yeah,
at the end of all this. I have to believe that, as an artist. And so, yeah, I mean, I think that's true in a lot of operas, right? There comes that moment where a character either chooses to go with the tenor or the baritone. Like, what am I going to decide to do? And how is that going to affect everything else? And I think that's where we find ourselves is COVID is not void of choices. If anything,
yeah,
it's allowing us to really think outside the box and try to make something beautiful.
yeah, yeah. No, I agree. It's also interesting, in addition to your performing, one of the choices you have made is to go into a mentorship and a teaching role. And you've got some recent news on how that has developed over time and a new position that you hold. And I wonder if you'd introduce the idea of how you made the decision to pursue that as part of your package of your career and where you are now. And
Sure. Yes, I believe you're alluding to my assistant professor position at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, which kind of happened gradually. I was teaching a few lessons here and there, actually, when I was in the Young Artist program. And then that developed into teaching a few more lessons while freelancing and trying to balance that life out. And then I was very fortunate I was working at Carleton College and teaching lessons, and I was subbing for a colleague of mine, Adriana Zabala, who everyone will see in this production. And I think I just realized that for myself, I had more to give in not just my performing, but in mentorship, as
Yeah.
you put it so well. And I think that for me, it felt like a calling. Like
Yeah.
I need to be sharing ideas. I need to be uplifting other young singers. Sometimes in a way that I maybe could say I didn't always feel uplifted. And I think that's important. I think it's our job as the next generation to really make sure that we're cultivating and listening to young people's voices and helping them find the trajectory. And I think that that calling was so strong for me that I thought, I really need to make this a larger part of my life. And thankfully, because I live in Minnesota, it's allowed it to be part of the full package
Right.
and not something I have to choose, which I know a lot of my colleagues do have to make a choice like that. So I'm very fortunate to be in the position that I'm in, and so far so good. The students are just a thrill to work with, and it's really exciting to see what the future of classical music holds.
Yeah. And with your work at the U, you said earlier that you were doing some work at home and some work on campus, but that's all of it's modified. So how do you safely, effectively teach voice during a pandemic?
Sure. And we talked about this a little before the interview. So the U's got a really nice setup where they actually have two rooms hardwired together so that the singer could be in one room and I can be in another room with the pianist. Both of us are masked and 6 feet apart. So that's one sort of quicker solution. But it's a lot of Zoom. There are a lot of other programs that people are talking about using to help create some of that zero latency. But I saw this chat at NATS, National Association Teachers of Singing, conversation that really stuck with me, which is the information is not changing. It's
Yes.
just the format with which you are delivering said
Yep.
information. I'm teaching a vocal pedagogy course, which I thought, oh, geez, how is this going to work on Zoom every week? And we're getting it done. I
Yep.
feel like the students are really learning something. So I think it's changing the way you listen is a really big part of it. What am I listening for exactly now? I think it's also trying to create as much community as possible. That's been a very big part of my time at the U, and even I teach some private students as well. It's just letting everyone feel like the music making is still happening, and it's not in an isolated vacuum, which I
Yeah.
think is very hard for all of us.
Yeah.
But finding opportunities for music sharing, I think, has been a really big thing. And just realizing that at the end of the day, we all want the same thing. We all want to express. We all want to be expressive. We all want to feel community, and that fortunately is not going to change whether it's on a screen through Zoom.
Yeah. Yeah. So what's just really quickly so we can wrap up? I know we've sort of hit our time, but what's uplifting you right now? I know there's so much that we're seeing if you flip on the news or talk to colleagues who are having to make really difficult decisions about livelihood and career. And, there's just so much that's bombarding us that I feel like is challenging. But are you finding things that are sort of bringing you a little hope and inspiration at the same time?
Sure. Aside from Netflix, yes, there are other things. I have to say a big part of it is just my own music making. Like, what do I want to do? I was just kind of working on a project. I have a small daughter. She's a year and a half now. And I'm working on like a project that would be essentially a gift to her, but would also put some music out for just positive vibes, just trying to create some kindness in the world. Um, just did a recital with Loft Recital, which is a Minneapolis-based organization of Alma Mahler. I think it's really about fulfilling those passion projects that have kind of been on the back burner.
Yeah.
What is the thing I've always wanted to sing? Yeah, I think I'm going to work on that. So that's kind of what I've been doing to feel some joy and hope.
I love that. Well, I'm also glad I'm aware that there are ups and downs in our daily life. And I used to talk about how, I had a down day every once in a while. Now I feel like it's measured in hours, where I could have like a really good morning, the late afternoon is not so great, and then maybe there's something that happens around the dinner hour that sort of brings things back up. But I'm happy that you are finding ways to interact with your creativity and with your art making. It's that comes and goes in cycles with many of our friends, where they feel compelled, and then there's also days where they just feel like they don't have anything to give creatively and need the break mentally. So it's exciting, and I think the project with your daughter sounds amazing.
We'll
And
see. I gotta put a few parts of it together, and it's really a vanity project. But I thought, something nice during this time.
well, and you never know what kind of kernel of inspiration others might find when they learn about that work too. So thank you for doing that, and thank you for being part of the Minnesota Opera family and for spending some time with me this afternoon.
Absolutely, always a pleasure. Thank you.
Great to see you. We'll hopefully see you soon in person, and hope that you either are ready to enjoy or have just enjoyed Wuthering Heights. Thanks for joining us.
When the radiance goes